The unwanted pine box, a mother's grief, and a grandmother's scorn in Judge Judy's court. The air in the television studio was cold, sterile, and thick with a silence that seemed to swallow sound whole. A stark and unsettling contrast to the storm of raw, unfiltered human emotion about to be unleashed within its confines. Under the unflinching, piercing gaze of Judge Judy, a woman whose reputation for slicing through deception with the precision of a scalpel preceded her, two families sat as islands of misery, separated by a chasm of loss and a bitter, venomous dispute over something that should have been sacred and untouchable. The burial of a young man, a son, a grandson, whose life had ended far too soon. This was not just a case about money. It was a tragic opera of shattered hearts, where the casket itself had become a brutal battleground, a symbol of a love so fractured, it continued to wage war, even in the shadow of the grave. The plaintiff, a woman named Linda, her face a fragile mask of weary sorrow, barely containing an ocean of pain, was the mother. Across from her sat the defendants, Susan and Frank Davison, the paternal grandparents, their postures rigid, their expressions a confusing mixture of defiance and something else, perhaps a flicker of shame, or maybe just the stubbornness of those who believed they had been wronged. The story that began to unfold was one that would make any parent's blood run cold. A harrowing tale that started with the unthinkable loss of a child and descended into a grotesque argument over the price of his final resting place. A conflict ignited by one single, shocking suggestion that the young man should be buried in a simple, cheap, wooden box. For Linda, the memory of that terrible day in the funeral home was not a mere recollection. It was a wound that refused to close, a scene she relived in her nightmares. The weight of her grief was a physical, crushing presence, a heavy stone lodged in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She had just viewed the casket she had painstakingly chosen for her beloved son, Michael, a final act of maternal love, a last effort to cradle him in dignity and peace. She had carried him for 9 long months, had felt his first kicks, had sung him lullabies, had bandaged his scraped knees, and had dreamed endless dreams for his future. Now all those dreams were reduced to this, selecting a vessel to lower into the cold, unyielding earth. Her son's wife, a young woman named Chloe, was financially devastated, her world equally shattered, leaving the burden of the funeral expenses to fall between Linda and her ex-husband. Into this sacred space of grief, Susan Davison, the paternal grandmother, had intruded. Linda remembered the exact chill that had entered the room when Susan spoke, her voice cutting through the soft, somber music of the funeral home. She had looked at the chosen casket, a last gesture of love from a mourning mother, and had uttered words that would forever be seared into Linda's soul. "We should change it," Susan had said, her tone practical, almost dismissive. "We should change it to a wooden box, a simple pine box. My own father was buried in a pine box. Why can't we do that for Michael?" The suggestion hung in the air, ugly and cheap, a profound insult to the memory of the vibrant young man they had lost. It wasn't about frugality. To Linda, it felt like an erasure, a statement that her son was not worthy of more, that his life had been as disposable as the proposed container. The maternal instinct, fierce and protective even in death, had roared to life within Linda. The rage was immediate, a white-hot fire that momentarily burned away the suffocating fog of her sorrow. This was her son. She had felt his life begin within her own body. She turned to Susan, her voice trembling, not with weakness, but with a fury so pure it was terrifying. "I told her," Linda stated, her words clear and sharp in the quiet courtroom, "that she needed to bug off. Those are just my words, because that was my son. I carried him for 9 months, and she had nothing to say or do with my funeral arrangements. The phrase "bug off," though polite for television, carried the weight of 1,000 more painful, unspoken curses. It was a mother's primal scream, translated into courtroom-appropriate language, a boundary drawn in the sand of her deepest despair. What followed was a tense, ugly exchange of what Linda could only describe as a few choice words, a polite understatement for the verbal battle that surely raged between two women, blinded by their own versions of love and entitlement. The sanctity of the moment had been shattered, replaced by a crass negotiation over the cost of death. In the aftermath of this clash, a proposition was made, one that would become the central piece of evidence in this courtroom drama. Susan Davison, perhaps attempting to regain some control, or to simply end the confrontation, had made an offer. She declared that she would give the young widow, Chloe, a sum of $1,000. The money was presented with a condition. Chloe was to do with it whatever she wished regarding the funeral expenses. It was a strategic move, bypassing the furious mother and placing the burden of choice on the grieving wife. Chloe, caught in the crossfire of this familial war, emotionally exhausted and financially crippled, had accepted the money. In a gesture that was both practical and symbolic, she had immediately handed the entire amount over to the mortician, a direct application of funds to the staggering, soul-crushing cost of saying goodbye. This $1,000 was not a gift born of compassion. It was a treaty payment in a Cold War, and it would prove to be a woefully insufficient peace offering. Judge Judy, a master of dissecting human agreements and pulling apart the threads of he said, she said narratives, began her methodical interrogation. She turned to Frank Davison, the grandfather, a man who had thus far been a quieter presence. "And how much were the expenses in total?" she asked, her voice devoid of any sentiment. All sharp business. The numbers were laid bare for the entire court to hear. Cold, hard figures that quantified a tragedy. The total cost of burying Michael was approximately $6,600. Frank Davison's agreed-upon share, after crediting the controversial $1,000 payment, was calculated to be $2,359.67. But Judge Judy was not just a calculator. She was a moral compass, and she immediately spotted the fissures in their financial agreement. She focused on the original promise, the initial obligation Frank had undertaken before the argument over the pine box had ever erupted. Ms. Davison brings a total to $4,600, not $6,500, she clarified, her mind working with rapid-fire accuracy. He agreed to pay $36.31. She pieced together the fractured contract, pointing out that Frank had originally obligated himself for a larger amount, $3,600, and had only paid half of that. His $1,000 payment through Chloe fell far short, leaving a deficit of at least $800 for the basic funeral director's costs. This was the simple mathematical truth of the case. But Judge Judy sensed there was more to the story, a deeper moral debt that had yet to be acknowledged. With the precision of a surgeon, she then exposed the most poignant and perhaps the most damning part of the financial neglect. "The original amount that you agreed to contribute," she stated, locking her eyes on Frank Davison, "did not include the opening and closing of the grave." The statement landed in the courtroom with a heavy thud. The image was inescapable and profoundly sad. A handsome casket, paid for by a grieving mother, but no provision for the earth to receive it. It was a half measure, an incomplete gesture that left the young man metaphorically and almost literally in limbo. Judge Judy, in a moment of stunning psychological insight, did not simply order him to pay. Instead, she appealed to his conscience, to the man he might be underneath the stubbornness and the legal defenses. "I'm asking you if today you are prepared to contribute something towards the opening and closing of the grave," she said, her tone shifting from that of a judge to something resembling a stern but caring elder. Frank Davison hesitated, stumbling over his words. Okay, if the circumstances at the time, if you know right now to answer your question, But Judge Judy cut through his evasion with a truth that was both simple and profound. You'll feel better if you say yes, she declared, and a ripple of knowing laughter spread through the audience. It was more than a witty remark. It was a stark revelation. This was no longer about winning a case. It was about a man being given a chance to redeem a piece of his own soul, to finally, fully, participate in the dignified burial of his own grandson. She continued, her voice imbued with the weight of her decades on the bench. Hopefully when people come to court, they can reach some sort of a resolution, even without somebody banging them over their heads. I think that morally, if not legally should be responsible for seeing to it that your son received an appropriate burial. And certainly that includes opening and closing the grave. That's what the cost was. In that moment, Frank Davison seemed to shrink. The fight drained out of him, replaced by the dawning awareness of his own failure. The argument about pine boxes and exact dollar amounts faded into insignificance, next to the stark, undeniable image of a grave that could not be filled. Yeah, he conceded, the single word heavy with surrender and a long overdue acceptance of responsibility. Judge Judy then delivered her judgment, a Solomon-like division that was both legally sound and morally righteous. She apportioned the costs, including the internment, and awarded Linda a judgment of $1,327. But everyone in the room knew the money was secondary. The true victory for Linda was the court's validation of her love, the affirmation that her son's life was worth more than a pine box, and the forced acknowledgement from the grandparents that they had a fundamental, moral duty to help lay him to rest, completely and with dignity. As the bailiff announced, "Parties are excused," and they rose to leave the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The raging storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of exhausted, but perhaps slightly healed hearts. Frank Davison, having finally agreed to do the right thing, would, as Judge Judy had promised, sleep better. And Linda could finally, after all the conflict, visit her son's grave, knowing that every part of his burial, from the casket to the earth that embraced it, was a testament to a mother's unwavering love, a love that had fought for his dignity until the very end. Lesson for the listeners and viewers. This tragic case serves as a stark and powerful reminder that while grief can manifest in strange and often conflicting ways, it should never be used as a weapon or an excuse to neglect our fundamental responsibilities to those we have lost. Legal contracts and financial agreements are important, but they are often secondary to the unwritten, moral contracts of love, respect, and dignity. When family disputes arise in the shadow of death, it is crucial to remember the person being honored and to prioritize their memory over pride, bitterness, or the desire to save money. A dignified farewell is not an extravagance. It is a final act of love, a necessary ritual for the living to find peace, and a basic right for the departed. Let this story compel you to have these difficult conversations with your family before it is too late, to ensure that when the time comes, your focus can remain on healing and remembrance, not on arguments over caskets and grave plots.